Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Settle in now. Let the lights go low, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day you had, whatever it held, begin to loosen its grip, one finger at a time. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to solve. Tonight, all you have to do is breathe and listen, and let a very old story carry you down into sleep like a slow river carrying a leaf. Tonight, we are going to travel a long way back, more than 2,000 years back, to an age when China was not one country, but many, when the land was carved into rival kingdoms that watched each other across their borders the way tired animals watch each other across a watering hole. And we are going to sit with one man, a prince who could barely speak, a thinker who wrote down the coldest, clearest instructions ever written for surviving in a world where you cannot trust anyone, and then, in the cruelest possible ending, died exactly the way his own instructions said a man like him would die. But let me begin where it hurts most, because I want you to feel the strangeness of it before I explain it. Let me begin at the end of his life, in a stone room with a cup of poison. Picture a cell. Not a dungeon of the storybook kind, with dripping walls and rattling chains, but something quieter and more final. A room in the kingdom of Qin, the strongest and hungriest of all those rival states. And in that room sits a man named Han Fei. He is a prince by birth, though his own small kingdom is fading, being slowly swallowed. He has come to Qin as an envoy, a messenger, carrying the hopes of a weaker state into the court of a stronger one. And now he is a prisoner. The door is shut. And someone he once knew, someone who sat beside him years ago as a student, learning from the very same teacher, has sent him a gift. The gift is a small measure of poison, and the message that comes with it is not spoken. But it is perfectly understood. Drink this. Do it yourself. Do it before the king changes his mind. The man who sent that poison was named Li Si. And Li Si was not a stranger. Li Si was a classmate. The two of them had studied together in their younger years, side by side, under the same demanding master. They had learned the same lessons, read the same arguments, sharpened their minds against the same hard ideas about what people really are underneath their manners and their promises. And now one of those two students was the second most powerful man in the most powerful kingdom on earth, and the other was sitting in a cell that the first one had arranged for him, holding a cup he had been told to drink. Here is the part I need you to hold on to, softly, as you drift. Han Fei had spent his whole life writing about this exact moment. Not this moment specifically, he could not have known the shape of his own last hours, but the kind of moment it was. He had written, in book after book, chapter after chapter, that you must never assume the people around you will act out of loyalty or affection or shared history. He had written that a man will do what serves him, and that the closer that man is to you, the more dangerous his ambitions become, because the closest people are the ones with the most to gain from your fall. He had written, in effect, the operating manual for exactly what Li Si was about to do to him. And Li Si did it anyway. Li Si looked at his old classmate, a man of extraordinary talent, a man whose writing had already caught the eye of the king of Qin, and Li Si did the coldest arithmetic there is. He asked himself a simple question. If this man rises here, what happens to me? And the answer was, I am eclipsed. I am replaced. A more brilliant mind takes the place I have climbed for years to reach. So Li Si, along with another minister named Yao Jie, went to the king and poured slander into his ear. They said the envoy could not be trusted, that his loyalty would always belong to his home state and not to Qin, that a man this clever was a man this dangerous. And the king, persuaded, had Han Fei thrown into that cell. And then, before the king could reconsider, before mercy could catch up, the poison arrived. They say the king did reconsider. They say that after a little time had passed, the king's heart softened, and he sent word to release the prisoner. But the word came too late. By the time the order reached the cell, Han Fei was already gone. The classmate had moved faster than the mercy. The incentive had outrun the pardon. Sit with the terrible symmetry of that for a moment, gently, without letting it tighten your chest, because this is a story, and the story is old, and you are safe and warm wherever you are lying right now. The man who taught the world to expect betrayal from the people closest to you was betrayed by the person once closest to him, in the exact manner he had predicted. His philosophy did not save him. His philosophy described him, and then it killed him. He was destroyed by the very thing he understood better than anyone alive, the plain, unsentimental truth that people, in the end, follow their own interests, and that no amount of shared history changes the math. We are going to spend this whole long night unfolding what that man wrote, and why it matters far more than a dusty story about a distant empire. Because here is the promise I want to make to you at the very start, so you can relax into everything that follows. This is not going to be a video about cruelty. It is very easy to hear the story I just told and think, so this Han Fei was a monster, a teacher of tyrants, a cold heart who deserved his cold end. That is the lazy version. That is what people say when they have not actually read him. What Han Fei actually left behind was something much stranger and much more useful. He left behind, quite possibly, the first genuinely rigorous operating system for functioning in a world where you cannot rely on anyone's good intentions, including your own allies' good intentions. Not a rulebook for being evil, a rulebook for not being destroyed. A way of arranging your affairs so that when people do act selfishly, and they will, it cannot bring the whole structure down on your head. And the astonishing thing, the thing that will follow you into your dreams tonight, is that this same cold and clear-eyed system did not die with him in that cell. It is still running. It is running quietly inside the contracts you sign. It is running inside the company you work for, whether or not anyone there has ever heard his name. It is running inside your government, inside your bank, inside every arrangement where one person has to depend on another person to do what they said they would do. Han Fei's fingerprints are on all of it. He built the machine, and the machine outlived him by more than 2,000 years. So let us slow down, and let us begin to take that machine apart, piece by piece, the way you might take apart an old clock on a quiet evening, not to break it, but to understand it. And the first piece, the very first gear, is the one he stated most plainly. It is this: do not read hearts. Read incentives. Han Fei had a way of making an idea land with a simple picture, and this one is my favorite, so let me give it to you the way he gave it. Imagine two craftsmen. The first is a carpenter, and this carpenter makes coffins. The second is a carriage maker, and he makes fine carriages for the wealthy to ride in. Now Han Fei says, the carpenter who makes coffins secretly wishes that men would die young, and the carriage maker secretly wishes that men would grow rich. And if you did not think about it carefully, you might jump to a conclusion. You might say, well then, the coffin maker must be a wicked man, hoping for death, and the carriage maker must be a good and kindly soul, hoping for everyone's prosperity. But Han Fei stops you right there. No, he says. That is not it at all. It is not because the carriage maker is kind and the carpenter is cruel. Neither man is thinking about your soul or your family or your virtue. Each man is simply hoping for the outcome that fills his own bowl. The coffin maker eats when people die. So some quiet, unexamined part of him hopes for deaths. The carriage maker eats when people are wealthy enough to buy carriages. So some quiet part of him hopes for wealth. Their wishes are not about good and evil. Their wishes are shaped, like water in a riverbed, by where their profit lies. Do you feel how freeing that is in a strange way? Han Fei is telling you to stop torturing yourself, trying to figure out whether the people around you are good people or bad people. That is the wrong question. That is a question with no reliable answer, because everyone believes themselves to be good, and everyone can tell a flattering story about their own motives. The reliable question, the one you can actually answer, is much simpler. What does this person gain from each possible outcome? Follow the profit, not the heart. Look at where a person's bread is buttered, and you will understand what they will quietly hope for and quietly work toward, no matter how warmly they smile at you across the table. This is the seed of the whole system. Do not build your safety on other people being good. Build your safety on understanding what they want and on arranging the world so that the thing they want lines up with the thing you need. Because good intentions are like weather. They change, they cannot be counted on, and no bridge should ever be built to depend on them. But incentives are like gravity, steady, predictable, always pointing the same direction. And you can build on gravity. Now Han Fei took this idea and pushed it somewhere most people are not brave enough, or perhaps not sad enough, to go. Because it is one thing to say, do not trust the stranger, the merchant, the rival. Anyone can nod along to that. But Han Fei said the danger does not come mainly from strangers. Strangers are far away, and their interests rarely cross yours in a way that can hurt you. The real danger, he said, comes from the people you love and trust the most. He wrote it almost like a warning carved over a doorway. Calamity comes from those you love and trust. And then he did something that must have made his readers deeply uncomfortable, because it is meant to. He named names. Not the names of individuals, but the names of roles, the roles closest to any ruler's heart. He warned the ruler against trusting his own wife. He warned him against trusting his own heir, the son who would one day inherit the throne. He warned him against trusting his closest and most favoured ministers, the ones he saw every day, the ones he had raised up and rewarded and come to rely on. And why? Not because Han Fei believed all wives and all sons and all ministers were secretly wicked. Go back to the coffin maker. It is the same logic, only now it is turned on the people at your own dinner table, and that is what makes it so cold and so hard to argue with. Think about the heir, the son who will inherit. What does that son gain from his father's long life? He waits. He grows older in his father's shadow. His inheritance sits just out of reach year after year. And what does he gain from his father's death? Everything. The throne, the power, the end of the waiting. Han Fei is not saying the son is a murderer. He is saying, look at where the profit sits. The son's incentives and the father's incentives point in opposite directions on the single most important question there is, which is how long the father lives. And a wise ruler does not pretend that arrow is not there just because it would be painful to see it. Or think of the favoured consort, the wife or the beloved companion, who has a son of her own. What does she gain if her son becomes the next ruler? She gains security, status, a future protected. And so, quietly, her interests bend toward arranging that outcome, toward pushing her son forward, toward clearing away rivals, toward influence she was never meant to hold. Again, Han Fei does not call her evil. He simply refuses to be blind. He says, her love may be real, and her ambition may also be real, and the second one does not vanish, because the first one exists. They live in the same person at the same time, the way warmth and cold can live in the same room. This is the part of Han Fei that the modern world often flinches from, and I understand the flinch. It feels lonely, doesn't it? It feels like a philosophy that would leave you unable to rest your head on anyone's shoulder. But I want to offer you a gentler way to hold it, one that I think is closer to what he actually meant. He is not telling you to love no one. He is telling you not to build your defenses on love. There is a difference, and it is an important one. You can adore your family and still not hand any single one of them the keys to everything you have. You can trust your closest friend and still write the agreement down clearly, so that no misunderstanding can grow between you in the dark. Love and structure are not enemies. Han Fei's whole argument is that when you have good structure, love becomes safer, because now nothing rests on the fragile hope that no one you love will ever have a reason to hurt you. The structure holds, even if the hope fails. And that, he would say, is what lets you sleep at night. So that is the man's central instinct, laid out plainly. Read incentives, not hearts. Expect the danger to come from close, not far. Build so that betrayal, if it comes, cannot topple you. Now let us go back and meet the man himself and the strange, sharp-edged world that made him. His name was Han Fei. In later centuries, out of respect, people added an honorific and called him Han Feizi, the Z at the end simply meaning something like master, a title of reverence given to great teachers. Master Han Fei. He lived roughly 280 to 230, 3 years before the Common Era, which is to say he was born into a world already very old and very tired of war. And here is the first thing to know about him, the detail that makes the whole story ache with irony. This man, the one who would write the most persuasive, most tightly reasoned arguments about power and control that his civilization had ever produced, could not speak well. He stuttered. According to the account passed down about his life, Han Fei had a stammer that made it difficult for him to argue aloud, to stand in a hall full of ministers and win a debate with his voice the way ambitious men were expected to do. In an age when so much depended on eloquence, on the ability to stand before a king and outtalk your rivals, Han Fei was locked out of the one arena where reputations were made. So he did the only thing left to him. He wrote. The man who could not persuade with his mouth learned to persuade with the brush and the bamboo strip, and he did it so powerfully that his written words reached further and cut deeper than any spoken speech of his time. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that. The great theorist of persuasive control could not himself persuade a single person face to face. He had to weaponize the written word instead, and he did, so completely that a king who would never hear his voice would fall in love with his ideas from the page alone. But we will come to that. Now, the world he was born into. To understand Han Fei, you have to understand that he did not write his cold philosophy in a time of peace, dreaming up cruelties for their own sake. He wrote it in the middle of a long, grinding, blood-soaked emergency. His era has a name that tells you everything you need to know. It is called the Warring States period, and the name is not poetry. It is description. For centuries, the land we now think of as China had not been a single country at all. It had fractured into a handful of rival kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own ambitions, all of them circling one another, all of them at war more often than they were at peace. Alliances formed and dissolved like frost on a window. Kingdoms that were friends one season were invaders the next. Rulers were assassinated by their own advisers, princes were murdered by their own brothers, whole states were swallowed and erased from the map. It was a world where trust was not a virtue but a luxury, and often a fatal one, where the ruler who assumed the best about the man beside him frequently did not live to regret it. Into that world, Han Fei was born a prince, but a prince of the wrong kingdom. His home was the state of Han, and Han was weak. It was one of the smaller, more vulnerable of the warring states, wedged in among stronger and hungrier neighbours, always one bad season or one lost battle away from disaster. Han Fei watched his own homeland struggle and shrink and grow ever more endangered, and this was not an abstract intellectual problem for him. It was personal. It was his family's kingdom bleeding out slowly in front of him, and it filled him with a kind of fierce, frustrated clarity. Because Han Fei looked around at the advisers surrounding the rulers of his day and at the philosophies they preached, and he came to a hard conclusion. He decided that most of the wisdom on offer was beautiful and useless. The gentle teachers of his age spoke of ruling through virtue, through ritual, through the moral example of a good and kindly king who would inspire his people to goodness by his own shining character. And Han Fei looked at his dying homeland, at the assassinations and the betrayals and the swallowed kingdoms, and he thought, this is a fantasy. This is a lullaby sung to men who are about to be conquered. You cannot defend a state with good manners. You cannot stop an invading army with the moral example of your king. In a world this violent, this crowded with ambition, hoping that people will simply choose to be good is not wisdom, it is suicide dressed up as nobility. And so Han Fei set out to build something else. Something that did not depend on people being good. Something that would work even if, especially if, the people involved were exactly as selfish and grasping and dangerous as the warring states had taught him to expect. He wanted a system so well designed that a mediocre ruler could run it and survive, and a treacherous minister could scheme within it and still be caught, and a kingdom could hold together not because everyone in it was virtuous, but because the structure itself made virtue unnecessary and betrayal unprofitable. That was the dream, a machine for survival in a world you cannot trust. And to build it, he was going to draw on the harshest, most unsentimental teacher of his youth, and on the ideas of thinkers who had come before him, and he was going to weld them together into something none of them had quite managed alone. He was going to take the raw, uncomfortable truth about human nature that he had learned as a student, the idea that people are not naturally good, that they must be shaped by something outside themselves, and he was going to build an entire theory of power on top of it. Because before Han Fei was a philosopher of his own, he was a student, and the man he studied under had taught him a single, uncompromising idea about what human beings are underneath, an idea that most people spend their whole lives refusing to look at directly. It was an idea that would become the foundation stone of everything Han Fei built. And sitting in that same classroom, learning that same hard lesson, was a young man with the same sharp mind and the same soaring ambition, a fellow student who would become, in time, the most powerful minister in the world, and the one who would send the poison. But to understand how those two students grew from the same root into such different men, and to understand the terrible idea they both drank in from their teacher, the idea that human nature itself is bad and must be forced into shape from the outside, we have to step back one more generation into the quiet of a philosopher's school, where a stern old master was teaching two of the sharpest young minds of the age a lesson that one of them would build an empire upon, and the other would use to build a cell. But an idea, even a hard one, only takes root in ground that's ready for it. And to feel why this particular idea sank so deep into this particular young man, you have to leave the quiet of the classroom for just a little while and step outside into the world that was waiting for him. Picture it slowly. This is China, more than 2,000 years ago, in the long, bloody stretch of time that later people would call the Warring States period. Say the name to yourself and let it settle. The Warring States. It is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a plain description. For centuries, the land was carved into rival kingdoms, and those kingdoms did nothing but war against one another, season after season, generation after generation, swallowing each other whole. A state that was proud and strong in one lifetime could be a memory by the next. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands marched across the fields. Alliances were made in the morning and broken by nightfall. A minister you trusted with your life could be, quietly, in the pay of the kingdom next door. This was the air Han Fei breathed from the day he was born. Not a world where trust was a virtue you could afford. A world where trust, misplaced, got you killed. And of all the kingdoms in that grinding contest, Han Fei was born into one of the weakest, the state of Han. A small place, hemmed in on every side, squeezed between larger and hungrier neighbours, forever bargaining and bending just to survive one more year. And the neighbour pressing hardest, the one whose shadow grew longer every season, was Qin. The same Qin that would, in the end, swallow Han entirely. So here is the strange truth at the very root of this story. The man who would write the coldest, clearest guide to holding power was himself born inside a state that was slowly, visibly losing it. He grew up watching a kingdom fail. He did not learn about weakness from a book. He watched it happen to his own home, from the inside, as a prince of a dying court, close enough to touch the mistakes and helpless to stop them. That is where a mind like his is forged. Not in comfort. In the sick, patient dread of seeing something you love mismanaged into the grave. And Han Fei, the record tells us, carried one more private weight, and it is almost too fitting to believe. The man who would become the great theorist of persuasion, of how to move a ruler, how to read the hidden currents of a court, could not speak well himself. He stuttered. The words caught and stumbled in his mouth. In a world that ran on eloquence, on ministers who could stand before a king and argue their case in a smooth, unbroken flood of speech, Han Fei could not do the one thing that seemed to matter most. He could not win the room with his voice. So imagine the loneliness of that. All this understanding, all this piercing insight into how power actually works. Locked up behind a tongue that would not obey him. Other men could charm and flatter and talk their way upward. He could not. And so he did the only thing left to him. He wrote. He took the pen where the stutter could not follow, and he poured everything onto the page instead. Every sentence a man delivers cleanly aloud, Han Fei had to build in silence, alone, in ink. The philosophy of control was written by a man who had almost no control over his own first, most basic instrument. There is a whole life in that single fact if you sit with it long enough. Now hold that picture. The dying state, the warring age, the prince who could not speak. Because I want to be very careful here at the start about what kind of book this man was actually writing, before anyone tells you otherwise. It would be so easy to call it a philosophy of cruelty, a cold manual for tyrants. That is the reputation that trails behind it like smoke. But that is not quite what it is, and if you walk away believing only that, you will have missed the far more useful, far more unsettling thing that is really on the page. What Han Fei was building was not a celebration of harshness. It was something closer to an operating system. A working set of rules for how to survive and hold together in a world where you genuinely cannot trust the intentions of the people around you. Including, and this is the part that stings, the people closest to you. Let me give you the clearest window into how his mind worked, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Han Fei asks you to think about two craftsmen. There is the man who makes coffins, and there is the man who makes carriages. The carriage maker, he says, sits at his bench and hopes that people will grow rich and rise in the world, because rich men buy fine carriages. And the coffin maker, at his bench, quietly hopes that people will die young. Now, Han Fei says, do not make the mistake of thinking the carriage maker is a kind and generous soul, and the coffin maker a wicked, ghoulish one. That is not it at all. Neither of them is good or evil. Each man simply profits from a different outcome. Each one wishes for the thing that fills his own table. Read that again in your mind as you drift. It is not that the coffin maker is cruel and the carriage maker is kind. It is that each responds to what pays him. And there, in that one small image of two craftsmen at their benches, is the whole foundation of everything to come. Do not read people's hearts. You cannot see a heart. Read their incentives. Read what they gain and what they lose, and you will know, far more reliably than any warm feeling could tell you, what they are truly likely to do. And Han Fei took that cold little lens and did something with it that most of us flinch from doing. He turned it, without blinking, on the people we are told never to doubt. He wrote, in plain words, that calamity comes from those you love and trust. Not from the stranger at the gate, from the ones inside it. He warned the ruler, in so many words, to be wary of his own wife, of his own heir, the son who stands to inherit everything the moment the father's heart stops, of his most beloved and trusted ministers, the ones closest to the throne. Not because Han Fei was a bitter man who hated love, but because he followed his own lens to its honest end. The heir gains from the father's death. The favoured consort gains from securing her own son's future. The trusted minister sits nearest the levers of power. Their incentives, he saw, can quietly point away from yours, no matter how much affection sits on top. And this, remember, is the man who would one day be handed a cup of poison. Handed it by an old classmate. A man he knew. A man whose incentives, if Han Fei had only turned his own cold lens all the way around, pointed exactly, precisely, at the act that was coming. To understand where Han Fei's thinking came from, you have to go back a little further, back before the books, back before the cold. Systematic arguments about rulers and ministers and incentives and verified results. Back to a classroom, or at least to whatever passed for a classroom, in the state of Qi in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, where a very particular teacher was doing something that most teachers of his era were not doing. His name was Junzi, written, sometimes rendered as Master Shun, and he was, by any measure, an unusual figure in the intellectual landscape of his day. He had come up through a tradition that most people, when they hear the name, associate with something quite warm. Confucianism, the tradition named for Kongzi, for Confucius, was, in its broad strokes, a philosophy built on the idea that human beings are essentially capable of goodness, that with the right cultivation, the right rituals, the right relationships, modelled on the love between parent and child, people could be shaped toward virtue, that the ruler who governed with genuine moral authority would draw the loyalty of the people the way a magnet draws iron filings. That benevolence was not just an aspiration, but a practical force in the world. Junzi stood inside that tradition and looked at it very carefully, and then he said something that must have felt, to his fellow Confucians, rather like being handed a cold cup of water when you were expecting tea. Human nature, Junzi argued, is bad. The word he used in classical Chinese was yi, which carries the meaning of badness or wickedness, and the compound phrase became sing yi. The nature is bad. Not complicated. Not ambiguous. Bad. What he meant by this needs a little unpacking, because it is easy to misread him as a simple pessimist and miss what is actually a careful, even compassionate argument. Zunzi was not saying that people are monsters. He was saying that what human beings are naturally inclined toward, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, wanting more rather than less, prioritizing what benefits the self, leads, left unchecked, to conflict, disorder, and suffering. Not because people are evil in their souls, but because uncultivated desire, without form or constraint, produces collision. The same way water flowing downhill produces floods, not because water is wicked, but because it follows its nature. And the answer, Shunzi said, was external discipline, ritual, structure, education, the shaping force of institutions. Not that you appeal to the goodness hiding inside each person and hope it surfaces. You build around the person. You construct the forms that channel inclination into something workable. This is the seed. This is where Han Fei's education began. Not in a tradition that trusted in moral nature. In a tradition that said, yes, people can be shaped, but the shaping has to come from outside. The material has to be formed. You do not count on the wood being straight. You use the plane. And sitting in those same lessons, somewhere nearby, was another young man. A student, like Han Fei, learning from the same sharp-minded teacher. His name was Li Si written. And the two of them, the stuttering prince from the weak state of Han and this other student, whose origins were humbler and whose ambitions were, if anything, larger, shared a teacher, shared a framework, and would share, across the decades that followed, a story so precisely constructed that it seems almost impossible that it was not invented. Except that it was not. This is what happened. Both of them went to Qin, and one of them destroyed the other, and the one who was destroyed had spent his life writing about exactly why the destruction was inevitable. But that is for later. For now, let us stay in the classroom. Let us stay with what they were learning, and what Han Fei, who absorbed it all and then went further, much further, built out of it. Because here is the thing about the intellectual tradition that Han Fei inherited from Junzi's school, and from the turbulent, violent world of the Warring States period in which both men lived. That period, written, Zhanggu Shidai, was not a metaphor. The Warring States period, running roughly from 475 to 221 before the Common Era, was exactly what it said. States at war, 7 major powers, each jostling for dominance, each building armies, each burning rival cities, each producing a steady, grinding casualty list of ordinary people who happened to be living in the way of someone else's ambition. Millions of people living in the shadow of the next campaign, the next border dispute, the next conscription order. The philosophers of the era were not writing in comfortable universities with nothing at stake. They were writing about survival, about what actually worked, about what kept a state alive and its people fed when the alternative was conquest and absorption by whoever fielded the most brutal and effective army. And it was in that context, practical, urgent, blood-soaked, that Han Fei did what no one before him had quite managed to do. He looked at the three main strands of legalist thinking that had developed before him, and he welded them together. Three strands, each from a different thinker, each addressing a different piece of the problem of governance, and Han Fei's particular genius, the thing that makes the Han Feizi. The 55-chapter text that bears his name, something genuinely different from what came before, was seeing that each strand alone was incomplete, that you needed all three, and that they had to fit together in a specific way. The first strand was called Fa, written. The word carries the meaning of law, of standards, of rules. And the thinker most associated with developing this strand into a serious governing tool was Shang Yang, written, a statesman who had served the state of Qin roughly a century before Han Fei's time, who had carried out sweeping reforms there, reforms that were harsh, that were resisted, that were eventually used against Shang Yang himself after his patron the Duke died. But that transformed Qin from a middling power into the most organized and militarily effective state in the known world. What Shang Yang understood about law was something deceptively simple, that it had to be public, written down, known in advance, the same for everyone who fell under it, regardless of who their father was or how close they stood to the ruler. Not guidelines, not precedents that a clever minister could reinterpret. Hard rules, announced clearly, with hard consequences for breaking them. Think about what this sounds like now. It sounds obvious. Of course rules should be public. Of course they should apply equally. We say this so reflexively that it barely registers. But in the aristocratic world of ancient China, where a noble's birth could, and frequently did, exempt him from consequences that would crush a commoner, where a ruler's favour could wipe away any offence, where law was a flexible instrument bent by whoever held the most power, in that world Shang Yang's insistence on written, uniform, applied without exception standards was genuinely radical. It was a claim that the rules mattered more than the people the rules were about, that the system was more important than any individual in it, and that, even then, was a hard thing for people to accept. So that is Fa, the law strand. Clear rules, public, consistent, applied without preference. The second strand was called Shu, written. The word carries the meaning of technique or method, specifically the ruler's art of managing ministers, and the thinker most associated with this strand was Shen Buhai. Written, a minister himself who served the state of Han, interestingly, the same small, vulnerable state that would one day produce Han Fei, and who focused not on the content of law, but on the ruler's relationship to the people administering it. Shen Buhai's insight was that the ruler's problem is not just writing good rules. It is that the people tasked with carrying out those rules have their own agendas. A minister will tell you what you want to hear, will shade his reports in the direction that makes him look good, will position himself between you and the information you need, passing through what flatters him and filtering out what doesn't. The ruler who relies entirely on what his ministers tell him is not actually ruling. He is being managed. So Shu technique is the art of checking, of appointing people in ways that reveal their true capabilities rather than their self-presentation, of setting ministers against each other gently so that no one becomes powerful enough to mislead unchallenged, of holding your own counsel, not revealing your preferences or your reasoning so that the people around you cannot simply tell you what you want to hear. Shu is the hidden administrative art of maintaining actual grip on an organization even when the organization is larger than any one person can directly supervise. And the third strand was called Shi, written. The word means something like positional power or authority that flows from position rather than from personal virtue. The thinker associated with this strand was Shen Dao, written, and Shen Dao's contribution was pointing out something that might seem obvious but has enormous implications. When a ruler gives an order and it is followed, what is the mechanism? Is it that the ruler is admired, that the ruler is wise, that the ruler is loved? Sometimes, perhaps, any of those. But Shen Dao argued that the underlying reality is simpler and more structural. The order is followed because the ruler occupies a position that commands obedience and the structures around that position. The rewards it can dispense, the punishments it can enforce, the legitimacy it carries, are what actually do the work. A different person sitting in that same position, even a less gifted or less virtuous person, would still be obeyed, because the obedience attaches to the position, not the person. The same instruction from a minister goes unheeded, from the ruler it moves armies. This is why, Shen Dao argued, you cannot govern by virtue alone. A saint who lacks the position cannot enforce anything. A mediocrity who holds the position can govern adequately. Positional power is real, structural, and does not depend on the character of whoever sits in it. Which means protect the position. Do not let it be eroded. Do not let its authority bleed away into the hands of ministers or favorites, because the moment the position loses its shi, its gravitational force, the whole structure begins to collapse, regardless of how personally excellent the ruler might be. Han Fei looked at all three of these strands and saw, with unusual clarity, why each one alone was insufficient. Far without Shu, law without the technique of checking ministers gives you a beautiful set of rules and ministers who game them. They know the letter of the rule, they work around its spirit. They write their reports to satisfy the standard on paper while doing whatever serves them underneath. The law sits there, clear and public, and completely ignored in practice, because no one is actually verifying whether the output matches the standard. Shu without Shai, the technique of checking, without the underlying positional power, gives you a ruler playing clever administrative games in a position that has no real weight. Clever tricks for testing ministers are useful only if the ruler actually has the force to punish or reward based on what he discovers. Without positional authority, the checking reveals things and then nothing happens, and the ministers learn quickly that they can be caught, and it does not matter. And Shai without Fa, positional power without clear, public, uniform law gives you arbitrary power. A ruler who can do anything but has no consistent rules produces ministers who cannot predict what will be rewarded or punished. So they optimize for pleasing the ruler personally rather than performing their actual function. The whole system becomes a performance of loyalty rather than a machine for getting things done. So what Han Fei built was the integration. Fa gives the standards. Shu gives the method of checking whether the standards are actually met. Shai gives the authority that makes the checking and the consequences real. Pull out any single leg and the whole thing wobbles. Hold all three together and you have something that does not depend on anyone's virtue, anyone's genius, or anyone's personal loyalty to function. You have a system. And the founding premise of that system, the bedrock assumption on which everything rests, is a single, cold claim that Han Fei stated in various ways throughout his writing. Do not rely on people being good. Do not arrange your governance so that things go well when people act in your interest and collapse when they do not. Instead, arrange things so that people cannot help acting in your interest because the incentives point that way. Or, at minimum, arrange things so that acting against your interest is sufficiently costly that even a rational, self-interested person would not choose it. The distinction is enormous. The ruler who governs by hoping people are loyal is perpetually vulnerable. Every morning he depends on the continued good intentions of dozens, maybe hundreds of people, any one of whom might, on any given day, decide that their interests point elsewhere. He has built a structure whose load-bearing elements are invisible things, intentions, loyalties, affections, that he cannot inspect and cannot reinforce. The ruler who governs by designing the incentives does not need to hope. He has built the structure so that the load-bearing elements are the rules themselves and the consequences that follow from them. The incentives hold whether the minister is loyal or not, whether he likes the ruler or resents him, whether he got a good night's sleep or didn't. The system runs on the facts of reward and punishment, not on the weather of human feeling. This is what Han Fei means when he writes that the ruler who counts on people acting in his interest out of love will be endangered, while the ruler who arranges things so that people cannot help acting in his interest will be secure. It is not a statement of misanthropy. It is a statement about engineering, about where you put the load. A bridge engineer does not hope the bolts will hold because the bolts have good intentions. He designs the load path so the bolts are not asked to do more than they can do, and then he checks them. Now, the checking. This is where we need to spend some time, because this is where Han Fei's system gets most precise, most demanding, and, honestly, most disturbing, and where the seeds of its own eventual failure are already present if you look carefully enough. Han Fei developed something he called Xing Ming, written, or sometimes, depending on which characters the text uses and which reading you follow. The translation that gets closest to the concept is something like performance and title, or form and name, and the operation is specific. A minister, or a subordinate of any kind, comes to the ruler and declares what he will do. He makes a claim. He names a target. He says, I will reduce the grain shortfall in the northern district by the winter harvest. I will have the new road completed in 6 months. Whatever it is, the point is that he has spoken a word. He has made a commitment. That word is the Ming, the name, the declared form of his intended performance. The ruler does not act on this declaration. He does not nod approvingly and file it away and trust that it will come true because the minister seemed sincere. He waits. And when the time comes, when the harvest is in, or the 6 months are up, he measures the actual result against the declaration. The actual result is the Xing, the form, the real shape of what happened, and then he compares the two. If the result matches the declaration exactly, the minister is rewarded. If the result falls short of the declaration, the minister is punished. This much most people would find straightforward. You promised something. You did not deliver. You face a consequence. Yes, that makes sense. But here is the part that makes people uncomfortable. And it should. Because it is the part where Han Fei's logic, followed to its honest end, reveals something important about what this system is actually built to do, and what it is not built to do. If a minister's result exceeds his declaration, if he said he would do 6 and he did 9, he is also punished. Read that again, slowly, because it is worth sitting with. The minister delivered more than he promised, he did better than he said he would. And he is punished for it. Why? Han Fei explains this with an example from the text, a story about a ruler's servants. There was a ruler who fell asleep, and the cold crept in. His capkeeper, the official whose designated function was the care of the ruler's hat and headdress, saw this and did nothing. Because hats are not robes. The capkeeper's job was hats, not warmth. He did what his title required, which was to attend to the ruler's headgear, and he left the ruler to feel the cold, which was someone else's defined responsibility. The coat-keeper, whose job was robes and warmth, was not present. Perhaps he had stepped away. Perhaps he did not know the ruler had fallen asleep. And a third servant, a man whose defined title covered neither hats nor robes, saw the ruler sleeping and saw the cold, and felt the simple human pull of kindness, and took a robe and spread it over the sleeping king. When the ruler woke, he was warm. He asked who had covered him. He was told, not the coat-keeper, who should have, but a servant whose title gave him no authority over the matter of robes at all. The ruler punished the coat-keeper for failing his defined responsibility. That is expected. But he also punished the man who had covered him, the one who helped, the one who acted kindly outside his defined role to prevent the ruler from being cold. And the reason Han Fei gives for this is precise. It is not that kindness is bad. It is that when people act outside their defined roles, even helpfully, even successfully, even with the best intentions, the system of defined accountability breaks down. If a servant can cover the ruler with a robe when the moment moves him to do so, then the coat-keeper has no way of knowing whether his defined responsibility is truly his, or whether anyone nearby might step in and take it over when they feel like it. The boundaries of roles become fuzzy, the accountability becomes unclear. And in a fuzzy, unclear system, when something goes wrong, there is no one to hold responsible. Because everyone can gesture at someone else's act of helpful improvisation. More deeply, if the servant who exceeds his brief is rewarded rather than punished, then ministers have an incentive to exceed their briefs constantly, to accumulate responsibilities, to expand their influence, to do more than they were told, and to receive credit for it, which is, from the ruler's perspective, the exact mechanism by which a minister begins to accumulate the kind of personal power that eventually becomes a threat. Helpfulness, unasked and undefended, is the first form of encroachment. So the punishment of the helpful coat spreader is not cruelty. It is the cold defense of a principle. Stay within what you declared. Do exactly what you said you would do, and nothing more and nothing less. The title creates the accountability. The performance is measured against the title, and any drift from the title in either direction is a deviation from the system. This is Xingming in its purest form. And sitting with it in the quiet, you can feel where it is brilliant and where it is ice-cold, where it makes a certain kind of absolute logical sense, and where it starts to produce outcomes that a human heart resists. The servant who kept a sleeping king warm was punished for kindness, and Han Fei would say, yes. Because a system that rewards kindness outside its designated channels has no system. It has only the randomness of human feeling. And the randomness of human feeling is exactly what you were trying to replace. We will come back to this. We will come back to what it costs. But for now, let it sit. Because the system has more to show us first. One of the consistent features of Han Fei's writing, one of the things that makes the text alive in a way that pure philosophical treatise sometimes is not, is the way he aimed it at real opponents. He was not writing in a vacuum, he was writing in a world thick with competing ideas about how to govern, and the competitors he was most eager to confront were the Confucians. The tradition of his own teacher, Sun Tzu, but more broadly, the tradition that drew its inspiration from Kongzi, from Confucius himself. And the Confucians had, at the core of their political thinking, a form of argument from the past. The sage kings of antiquity, they said. Yao, Shun, the Duke of Zhou. These were the models. In the golden age before the disorder of the warring states, in that ancient era of wisdom and ritual and right relationships, the rulers governed through virtue, and the people lived in harmony. If you want to restore order, the Confucians argued, look to those ancient exemplars, revive their ways, govern as they governed. The old methods worked then and will work again. Han Fei hated this argument, and he said so with characteristic directness through a story. A farmer in the ancient state of Song was working his field one day when a hare, running in panic from something, struck a tree stump with such force that it broke its own neck and fell dead at the farmer's feet. The farmer, who had in a single moment received more meat than his labour usually produced in days, thought this is a good arrangement. He stopped farming. He sat by the stump. He waited for the next hare. The hare did not come. The fields went untended. The farmer became, in the way that story farmers do, the object of ridicule in the whole kingdom. The story is called Waiting by the Stump. In classical Chinese, Shou Zhu Dai Tu. And Han Fei's point was not subtle. If you govern the people of your age by the methods of the ancient sage kings, he said, you are like the farmer at the stump. You had one piece of luck in one specific set of conditions, and now you sit watching the same spot, expecting the same result to appear from the same place, even though everything that produced the original outcome has changed. The world of the sage kings, Han Fei argued, was a different world in every material way that mattered. The population was small. Resources were abundant relative to the number of people competing for them. In those conditions, a ruler could afford to be generous and moderate and rely on good faith, because scarcity was not pressing and competition was not desperate. When there is enough for everyone, the incentives for conflict are weaker. Morality, in that environment, is relatively cheap. But the world of the warring states period was not that world. More people, harder competition for the same, or in some cases diminishing, resources, states devouring each other. Armies constantly in the field, the population of a conquered territory absorbed or destroyed. In those conditions, Han Fei argued, relying on morality is not wise and ancient, it is naive and dangerous. You cannot feed people on virtue. You cannot stop an invading army with good intentions. The material conditions have changed, and the governing tools must change with them. This is a strikingly modern-sounding argument. What Han Fei is doing here, arguing that the ethics appropriate to a given era are shaped by the material conditions of that era, that what works when there is enough is different from what works when there is not enough, is a kind of materialist analysis that sits unusually far ahead of its time. He is not saying that morality is fake. He is saying that morality is downstream of conditions, that the virtue appropriate to abundance may become a liability in scarcity, and therefore watch the present. Legislate for the world as it is, not as it was in a story your grandparents told about a better age that may or may not have actually existed the way they described it. Do not wait at the stump. The hare broke its neck by accident. The accident will not repeat on command. Write your rules for the conditions you actually face. Do not govern the present with the methods of a different past. And this connects directly back to the founding premise. Because part of what Han Fei is doing when he insists on incentives rather than virtue is insisting on something that changes with the world, incentives can be recalibrated, law can be updated, the rules can be rewritten when conditions shift. But if your system depends on a kind of virtue that was appropriate in a different era, on a moral culture that flourished in conditions of abundance and is now being asked to hold under conditions of scarcity and war, then you have nothing to pull on when the culture cracks. You have built your house on the weather. There is something quietly radical in Han Fei's insistence that governing methods must be fit for their time. The Confucians looked backward for authority. Han Fei looked at the present, at what was actually happening in the actual world, and asked what tools would work here, now, in this. Not in Song's golden age, not in the reigns of Yao and Shun. Here, now, in a world where the incentives were real, and the consequences were real, and the competing armies were real, and the question of how to keep a state functioning under those pressures was not a philosophical seminar, but a matter of daily survival. And yet, and this is worth noticing, because it is the texture of a real thinker rather than a pamphleteer, he was not arguing against all moral aspiration. He was arguing for sequencing. First, make it so that acting badly is too costly. Build the floor. The rules, consistently applied, punishments that hold, rewards that are reliable enough to believe in. Once you have the floor, once behavior is governed by a system solid enough that you do not need to depend on everyone being personally virtuous, then, perhaps, in the stability that follows, culture can grow. Morality can take hold. But it cannot substitute for the floor. It cannot replace the structure. It can only grow from it. Afterward, slowly, in the space the structure makes safe. It is a cold vision of sequencing, but it is not a vision that denied the possibility of something warmer eventually. It just refused to pretend that the warmth could come first, before the cold work was done. And the cold work, the system, the verification, the checked performance, the two handles waiting just ahead, was what Han Fei spent his life building in writing, because it was what he could not build in any other way. The stuttering prince from the weak state of Han, who had ideas about how power should be organized and a court that did not use them, who watched his home state fail to implement the reforms it needed, watched it remain vulnerable, watched the larger powers circle it the way wolves circle something that cannot run fast enough, and who put all of it, all the clear sight and cold analysis and frustrated urgency, into the written word. Because that was what he had, not a voice that carried in a room, not the charm or the fluency that could move a minister in the moment, face to face, before the thought had cooled. He had the capacity to sit with the full complexity of a problem and turn it until it revealed its structure, and then write that structure down in sentences precise enough to cut glass. He had the patience of a man who cannot win the argument out loud, and so constructs the argument on the page so carefully that it has to be answered on its own terms. He had the irony, perhaps unwitting, of understanding the mechanism of persuasion better than almost anyone. In the chapter he titled The Difficulties of Persuasion, and being unable to deploy that mechanism himself in real time, in the room, with a living listener in front of him. That chapter, The Difficulties of Persuasion, it is worth pausing on, because it is, in some ways, the most personally revealing thing Han Fei wrote, the place where the theory and the autobiography get closest to each other. What Han Fei argues in that chapter is that the difficulty of persuasion is not that you have failed to construct a good argument. It is that you have failed to read the person you are trying to persuade. The person in front of you, the ruler, the patron, whoever holds the power you need to influence, has real desires, real fears, real sensitivities, real vanities. And if you present your argument without having first mapped those correctly, you will trigger a response that has nothing to do with the quality of your logic. You will hit a nerve you didn't know was there. You will make someone feel criticized when they wanted to be praised, or suggest a change when they wanted validation for what already exists. The skilled persuader, Han Fei writes, must read the person, must know what they truly want, even when it is not what they say they want. Must present even a challenging argument in the frame the listener can hear without flinching. He understood all of this. He diagnosed it precisely. He could describe the mechanism in extraordinary detail. And he could not do it himself. In the room, in real time, where the stutter came and the fluency failed and the argument that was perfect on paper became in the air something that could not find its way from his mind to the listeners without breaking. There is something almost unbearably human in that. The man who understood more about the psychology of communication than almost anyone in his era, who sat down and wrote the manual on how to be heard by powerful people, who could not, himself, be heard by powerful people when the moment came and the words had to live in sound and not in ink. He wrote it down instead. All of it. Every insight about law and technique and positional power and the verification of performance and the reading of incentives. The cold, magnificent system for a world you cannot trust. He wrote it down. And eventually, across the years and the distance, the most powerful man in the known world came across those pages. But we are not quite there yet. Because before that story can pay off, we need to understand the full machinery that Han Fei assembled, the rules he laid out for operating in a world of misaligned incentives, not just the premise, make it costly to be bad rather than hoping people are good, but the specific tools, the two handles, the design of indispensability, the hidden preferences, the structure that means no single betrayal can undo you. That machinery is what the viewer came here for, and it is what we will move through next, slowly, piece by piece, in the way that a mechanism deserves, not rushed, not summarized, but opened up and examined and understood, the way you understand a thing when you hold it in your hands and turn it in the light and see how each part fits against the next. The carpenter does not trust the wood. He shapes it. And the shaping works better when you understand the wood. So let us begin with the handles. Han Fei called them Bing, the two handles. And once you understand what he meant by that, once the image settles into your mind, you will find it difficult to look at any organization, any team, any relationship with a significant power differential, and not immediately ask who is holding them. The image he uses is not complicated. It is almost startlingly simple for a philosophy that sometimes reaches into great complexity. The ruler, Han Fei says, holds two things and two things only. The first is punishment. The second is reward. That is the entire instrument. Not speeches, not loyalty, not the warmth of a long relationship or the accumulated goodwill of years of service. Punishment and reward. He calls them sing and day, consequences and favour, roughly speaking, and he argues that these two handles, kept together and used deliberately, are what actually constitute power. Not the title, not the ancestry, not the armies exactly, though armies are downstream of this. The handles. Think of it the way you might think of a door. A door can be enormous, heavy wood, iron fittings, a door you could not move with your shoulder if you tried. But every door, no matter its size, turns on its hinges. Two small pieces of metal, seated just so, and the whole weight pivots. The hinges are the handles. Everything else is ornament. And Han Fei's warning, stated with a directness that feels almost blunt after all the careful build-up of the chapters before it, is this: the moment a ruler allows someone else to dispense punishment and reward on his behalf, that person has taken the handles. And the one holding the handles rules, regardless of what any title or ceremony or document says about who is nominally in charge. He gives examples. He always gives examples. A ruler who lets a favoured minister decide who gets promoted and who gets exiled has handed that minister the favour handle. The minister can now build loyalties that flow toward himself, not toward the ruler. People perform for the one who holds their advancement. This is not treachery in any dramatic sense, it is simply how incentives work. The servants will naturally orient toward the source of their futures. And once that orientation has shifted, the ruler still sits at the top of the ceremony, still receives the bows and the formal titles, but the actual lines of influence in the room run elsewhere. This is still happening. It never stopped happening. Every time you wonder why a company's official leadership seems somehow less powerful than its actual leadership, why the person with the impressive title seems to be working around someone else who has no title at all, the answer is usually the handles. Whoever controls compensation reviews, whoever can end careers or elevate them, whoever decides what gets funded and what gets quietly buried, those people hold Bing regardless of what is printed on their business cards. Han Fei was not describing a dysfunction, he was describing a mechanism. The dysfunction is in pretending the mechanism does not exist. And because he understood the mechanism so clearly, he also understood the danger of letting the handles drift. Not just the political danger, the personal one. Once the handles have left your hands, he argues, you cannot simply ask for them back. The person holding them has accumulated dependencies. Others have arranged their lives around the assumption that this person controls their futures. To reclaim the handles is to overturn a whole web of expectations and investments. And the person holding them will resist that, not from malice, but from self-interest, which, as we have established, is the only thing you can reliably count on. So the instruction is, never let them leave. Not temporarily, not for convenience, not because you trust someone completely. The handles stay with the ruler. This is not cruelty. It is precision. You are not saying that no one can ever be trusted with delegated authority. You are saying that the thing that makes authority real, the actual power to reward and punish, should always flow from a known, accountable source, and that source should be you. There is something almost restful in that clarity if you let yourself sit with it. Not the politics of it, not the cold strategic calculation, but the simplicity. Two handles. That is all. You do not need 1,000 variables or a perfect read of every person's intentions. You need to know where the handles are, and you need to keep your hands on them. Now let us move from the handles to the architecture around them. Because holding the handles is not enough on its own. The system needs to be built so that the handles mean something, so that they are the real instruments of influence and not just formal gestures. And that requires a kind of deliberate design that Han Fei laid out with the same methodical care he brought to everything. The first principle of this design is, do not make anyone indispensable. This sounds, at first, like bad management advice. The world tells us to build deep expertise, to create people who are irreplaceable assets to their teams, to invest in specialists who know things no one else knows. And in certain contexts, within certain limits, that is correct. But Han Fei is pointing at something different. He is pointing at the danger of a single point of failure, a single person whose removal would collapse the system, whose knowledge or relationships or access you cannot function without. Because the moment someone becomes indispensable, the handles shift, not dramatically, not necessarily with any conscious intention on anyone's part, but the person who cannot be fired, whose departure would cause too much disruption, whose knowledge is too concentrated, whose relationships are too valuable, that person has acquired leverage. And leverage, over time, becomes power. And power, used rationally in a world of self-interested actors, will eventually be used in ways that serve the person holding it. That is not a character flaw, that is the shape of the incentive. So the ruler, and by ruler, Han Fei means anyone responsible for the stability of a system, which in his time was a literal ruler, but in ours might be a manager, a director, a founder, a committee, should structure things so that no single person's absence would be catastrophic. Knowledge should be distributed. Relationships should be held in the system, not in individuals. Access should be shared, not concentrated. Not because people are untrustworthy in some absolute sense, but because you do not want the architecture of your organization to be hostage to any single person's continued loyalty. You have seen the reverse of this. Everyone has. The team that cannot function when a certain person goes on leave. The department whose entire institutional memory lives in one person's head. The company that loses a key relationship the moment a specific employee leaves because the relationship was personal and not structural. These are not just operational inconveniences. In Han Fei's framework, they are vulnerabilities, points where the system can be undone by a single betrayal or even just a single accident. Redundancy is not waste. It is resilience. And resilience is what keeps the handles where they belong. The second principle of the design goes a step further, and it is the one that sometimes makes people pause. Han Fei argues that the ruler should keep his own preferences hidden. This is worth slowing down over, because it can sound like a recommendation for dishonesty, and that is not quite what it is. The argument is more precise than that. A revealed preference, Han Fei says, is a lever that others can use on you. If your ministers know that you love a particular kind of music, they will commission music. If they know you dislike confrontation, they will never bring you news that requires a confrontational response. They will smooth it, delay it, filter it, until it no longer resembles the truth. If they know you are anxious about a particular minister's loyalty, someone who wishes you ill will feed that anxiety with carefully placed rumors. This is not the behavior of exceptional villains. It is the behavior of rational people operating in an environment where pleasing the powerful person is the path to reward. And if you have internalized the logic of the handles, if you understand that the powerful person controls your future, then you understand why people bend themselves toward what the powerful person wants. It is not sycophancy, exactly, it is survival. The ruler who reveals his preferences has in effect handed others the instructions for managing him, and the information flowing to him will be shaped by those instructions, sorted and trimmed and adjusted until it tells him what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. He ends up making decisions inside a constructed reality, curated by people whose incentives are to please him, not to inform him. The hidden preference is a kind of counterintelligence, then. By not revealing what conclusion you have already reached, you preserve the possibility of receiving actual information rather than confirmation. By not showing what outcome you prefer, you make it harder for the people reporting to you to shape their reports around your preferences. You keep the information channel honest, or at least less dishonest, by removing the obvious incentive to distort it. This principle has a kind of quiet dignity to it when you hold it alongside everything else Han Fei has written. He is not recommending coldness for its own sake. He is trying to solve a real problem. Powerful people live inside information bubbles of their own construction because the people around them have learned what they want to hear. The only partial defense against this is to make it harder for others to know what you want to hear. It is not a perfect solution, but it is a principled one. Now take all of this, the handles, the distributed design, the hidden preferences, and hold it alongside one more principle, the one that ties everything together. The system should not need a genius to run it. Han Fei states this with unusual directness. He says that if a state requires a sage to function, it will rarely function, because sages are rare. The wisdom of exceptional individuals is not a governance strategy. You cannot plan for it. You cannot train it at scale. You cannot reliably pass it from one generation to the next through ordinary succession. A system that depends on the brilliance of the person at the top is a system that works beautifully when the brilliant person is there and collapses when they are not. Which means it is, in any long view, not a system at all. It is a prolonged, lucky streak. The alternative Han Fei proposes is almost modern in its sensibility. Build the machinery well enough that an average ruler can operate it successfully. Write the laws clearly enough that they do not require interpretation by a wise judge to be applied correctly. Design the incentive structures precisely enough that ordinary people, pursuing their ordinary self-interests, end up producing the outcomes the system needs. Do not depend on exceptional virtue at the top. Create conditions in which ordinary people with ordinary motivations produce extraordinary stability. This is the quiet heart of legalism, and it is often missed in the more dramatic discussions of punishments and controls and the coldness of the doctrine. Han Fei was not only building a cage for bad actors, he was building a system that could survive ordinary ones, that could absorb the mediocre, the distracted, the self-interested, the afraid, all the normal textures of human governance, and still produce a functioning state. Not because he believed human beings were capable of better, because he did not count on them to be. There is something almost compassionate in that, if you squint at it from a certain angle. He is not a cynic who hates people. He is a realist who has looked at people clearly enough to build for what they actually are, rather than what he might wish them to be. The loving manager and the visionary founder are wonderful when they appear. The system should work without them. Institutions over heroes. That is the principle. And it is as useful today in the design of organizations and contracts and governments as it was in the state of Qin in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Let us rest there for a moment. Let the weight of that settle. Because these principles, the handles, the distributed design, the hidden preferences, the system that works without saints, they are already doing something to how you see your own world. You are already applying them, quietly, to structures you know. And before we cross into the modern bridges, before we bring in the economists and the theorists who rediscovered these same shapes in mathematical dress, there is one more face of Han Fei's system that deserves to be seen clearly. Because there is a version of legalism that is easy to caricature, a cold, mechanical, punitive apparatus designed to crush individuality and enforce compliance. And some of what Han Fei wrote can certainly be read that way. But there is another face to it, quieter, more principled, and in some ways more radical for its time than anything in the colder chapters. The law, Han Fei wrote, does not fawn on the noble. Let that sit for a moment. In the world Han Fei was writing in, the principle that a great family could simply absorb the consequences of law, could be exempted from punishment, could receive favour simply by virtue of birth and lineage, was not a corruption of the system. It was the system. Aristocratic privilege was not an abuse, it was the designed structure. The ancient rites and customs that the Confucians wanted to restore and preserve were, in many cases, rituals that encoded exactly this hierarchy, that some people were simply, by virtue of birth, above accountability. Han Fei said no. He wrote that when the law is applied, the wise cannot reject it, and the brave cannot dispute it. Punishment for fault does not spare ministers. Reward for good does not skip commoners. The rule applies to everyone who falls within its jurisdiction, regardless of their name or their ancestors or their accumulated favour with the ruler. This is not a minor administrative preference. In the context of the Warring States period, this is a revolutionary claim. It is the argument that the standard must be external and universal, that what matters is not who you are, but what you did and what you are owed for it. The rule is public. It is written down. It is the same rule for the powerful minister and the ordinary farmer, at least in principle. And notice what this does in combination with everything else. The public law is the external standard against which Xingming, the verification of performance against the stated title, operates. Without a published, consistent rule, the verification process is arbitrary. The ruler can punish or reward based on whim, and Xingming becomes a tool of personal power rather than institutional accountability. But with a public rule, a known standard that was set in advance and that applies uniformly, the system has legitimacy. The person who gets punished can be shown the rule they violated. The person who gets rewarded can point to what they achieved. The standard exists outside the personal will of the ruler or the minister. It is, in its way, a kind of impersonal fairness, cold, yes, but fair in the sense that it applies to everyone. This is the humane edge of legalism, not soft, not warm, not relying on anyone's virtue, but genuinely equal in its application. And Han Fei understood that this consistency was not just ethically better, it was functionally better. Because a rule that is known and applied consistently is a rule that people can plan around. They know what will be rewarded. They know what will be punished. The uncertainty that drives people toward flattery and information gaming and manipulation. The uncertainty that Han Fei spent so many pages trying to design out of governance is reduced when the standard is clear and consistent. Predictability, he argued, is not a concession to niceness. It is a functional requirement of any stable system. Rewards must be reliable enough to be believed. Punishments must be certain enough to be feared. If they are erratic, sometimes applied, sometimes not, sometimes modified by personal relationship or current favor. They lose their power. A punishment that might or might not happen is less than half as effective as a punishment that always happens. An erratic reward is not a reward at all. It is a lottery, and people respond to lotteries differently than they respond to earned outcomes. The law that is public and consistent is a law that works. The law that is secret, arbitrary, or differentially applied is a law that is already failing, because it has already ceded control to the vagaries of personal relationship and momentary preference, the very things Han Fei was trying to replace. Sit with that for a moment. The cool evening light of it, a system that is impersonal, written, and uniform. Not because the ruler is too distant or too cold to care about individuals, but because a personal, informal system is, paradoxically, a less reliable system. It depends on the ruler's mood, on who was in the room when the decision was made, on which minister had the most recent access. A system that operates the same way whether the ruler is attentive or exhausted, generous or worried, that is a more powerful system than one that flexes with every personal variable. This is what Han Fei meant. Not a mechanical heartlessness, a designed reliability. And now, having moved through all of this, the handles, the distributed design, the hidden preferences, the system that survives ordinary rulers, the public and consistent law, we arrive at the bridge that Han Fei himself never crossed, because he lived 23 centuries before it was built. In 1976, two American economists named Michael Jensen and William Meckling published a paper that would become one of the most cited works in the history of their field. The paper described something they called the principal-agent problem. The language is precise and a little dry in the way that economics papers tend to be, but the problem it describes is ancient and immediate. The principal-agent problem is this: you have a principal, a person who wants something done, and you have an agent, a person who is supposed to do it on the principal's behalf. The principal cannot perfectly observe what the agent is doing at all times. The agent has their own interests, which are not identical to the principal's. And so the agent, acting rationally and in their own interest, will sometimes make choices that serve themselves at the expense of the principal. Not necessarily through malice, frequently through nothing more sinister than the ordinary human preference for easier paths, personal advancement, or reduced risk. The relationship between a shareholder and a manager, a patient and a doctor, an employer and an employee, a citizen and a government official. In every case, there is someone who wants an outcome and someone who has been engaged to produce it. And their interests do not perfectly align, and the person who wants the outcome cannot watch every moment of the process. This is the principal-agent problem. And every institution in the modern world is, in some sense, a set of partial answers to it. Han Fei was solving the principal-agent problem in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He called the principal the ruler and the agent the minister, but the structure is identical. The ruler wants outcomes, the minister is engaged to produce them, the minister has their own incentives, the ruler cannot watch everything. And so, Han Fei designed Xing Ming to verify output against stated intention. The two handles, to keep the reward and punishment levers in the ruler's hands, the prohibition on personal indispensability, so that no agent can accumulate leverage. The hidden preferences, so that agents cannot shape the information flow toward the ruler's known biases. The parallel is not an analogy, it is a convergence. Two different traditions, separated by more than 2 millennia and an ocean of cultural distance, running into the same structural problem and arriving at the same structural solutions. Because the problem is not cultural, it is not historical, it is mathematical. When you have misaligned incentives and incomplete information, you get a certain class of failure modes, and there are only so many ways to address them. In 2007, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to three men, Leonid Hurwitz, Eric Maskin, and Roger Myerson, for laying the mathematical foundations of what is called mechanism design. Mechanism design is, at its core, the systematic study of how to build rules and incentive structures that produce desired outcomes even when the people operating within them are acting in their own self-interest. You design the game so that the rational move, for everyone playing, produces the outcome you want, not by making people good, not by appealing to their virtue or their loyalty, by making it in their interest to behave well. Mechanism design is Han Fei in mathematical notation. The alignment of incentives that Han Fei described as governance is what Hurwitz and Maskin and Myerson formalized as a field of inquiry. Make it costly to be bad. Make it rewarding to be good. Write the rules clearly enough and apply them consistently enough that rational self-interested actors end up producing the collective outcome you need. The difference is that Han Fei did not have the mathematics. He had the insight, the directness, and the 23 centuries of head start. When we encounter modern institutional tools, audits, key performance indicators, service-level agreements, escrow arrangements, whistleblower systems, separation of duties, mandatory secondary sign-offs, we are encountering Xing Ming. We are encountering Han Fei's verification principle, written in the language of modern organizations. The audit says, we will not simply trust that the accounts are accurate, we will send someone to verify. The KPI says, before you begin, you will tell us what result you are aiming for, and afterward we will measure whether you achieved it. The escrow says, funds do not release until the condition is met, not because we suspect fraud, but because we do not need to suspect anything, the mechanism handles it regardless. The separation of duties says, the person who approves an expenditure should not be the same person who executes it, so that no single actor can manipulate both sides of a transaction. These are not cynical tools. They are not expressions of distrust in any personal sense. They are, in the most precise meaning of the term, designed systems. Systems that function without requiring the people inside them to be saints. Systems that let ordinary people with ordinary motivations produce trustworthy outcomes. Systems built for the world as it is, not the world as you might wish it to be. There is a phrase, probably more famous in its English version than in its original Russian, that Ronald Reagan found himself returning to throughout the nuclear arms reduction talks of the 1980s. He would say it whenever anyone asked how agreements could be trusted, how verification could replace faith in the good intentions of the other party. He would say, trust, but verify. It is a compression of 4 words from a Russian proverb, and it is Xing Ming. It is the performance against title doctrine, folded into a sentence that even a tired diplomat could remember. You do not need to suspect the other party of bad faith. You do not need to believe they are untrustworthy people. You simply build the inspection regime into the agreement from the start, so that trust does not have to do all the work alone. Han Fei would have recognized the logic immediately. He might have approved of the compression. He was, after all, a man who spent his career trying to translate complex governance principles into clear, memorable language, laws that could be written down and known and applied. 4 words that contain a governing philosophy. He would have understood that. But let us not drift too far into the modern resonances before noting something that Han Fei himself, if he was as rigorous as his writing suggests, would have insisted on being said. The tools we are describing, the audits and the KPIs and the escrow arrangements and the separation of duties, these are expensive, not just in money, in something more fundamental. Trust has an economy. When you verify everything, you send a signal. The signal is, I do not believe your word is sufficient. And people respond to that signal. Not always with resentment, sometimes with relief, because a clear external standard removes the ambiguity of subjective evaluation. But sometimes with a kind of withdrawal, a narrowing of commitment to exactly what is measured and nothing beyond it, a shift from acting in the spirit of the agreement to acting in its letter. This is Goodhart's law, which we will return to in time. But even before we arrive at the formal statement of it, you can feel the shape of the problem. A system that measures everything creates incentives to perform for the measurement rather than for the underlying goal the measurement was designed to track. The doctor who is measured on appointment times will see more patients briefly rather than fewer patients thoroughly. The teacher who is evaluated by test scores will teach to the test. The manager who is assessed on quarterly earnings will manage for the quarter. In each case, the metric has displaced the goal it was meant to represent. Han Fei knew this at the edges, though he did not name it as a law. His own example of the capkeeper and the coat-keeper, the servant punished for covering a sleeping king with a robe, is already a system producing the wrong behavior through the mechanism of strict performance to title. A servant who has been punished for helpful overreach will not be helpfully overreaching again. They will be doing exactly their defined job and nothing more. The verification system has taught them to be less than they could be. The system that Han Fei built is a superb flaw. It catches the failures that virtue-based systems miss. It functions in low-trust environments, in violent periods, in conditions where you genuinely cannot rely on goodwill alone. But it has a ceiling, and the ceiling is lower than you might want. High-trust organizations do things that low-trust organizations cannot. A team that trusts each other's judgment does not need to verify every decision through multiple sign-offs. It moves faster because the verification overhead is removed. A team where people feel safe to flag problems early before they become crises produces better outcomes than one where people are afraid to report failures for fear of punishment. Because in the punitive system, bad news gets hidden until it is unavoidable. A culture where people work beyond the strict definition of their roles, where the servant does cover the sleeping king with a robe and knows they will not be punished for it, is a culture with more bandwidth, more resilience, more capacity to absorb unexpected situations and respond to them well. Han Fei's system does not produce this. It was not designed to. It was designed to produce stability and accountability in conditions where trust was already absent, where the Warring States period had so thoroughly shredded every institutional basis for confidence in anyone that something else, something harder and more mechanical, was needed to hold things together long enough to stop the bleeding. But if you run the system in conditions where trust could exist, if you take the tools that were designed for a zero-trust environment and apply them to an environment where some trust is possible, you do not just fail to gain the benefits of trust. You actively destroy it. Because the act of verifying what need not be verified tells people they are not trusted. And people who do not feel trusted often stop being trustworthy in the ways that cannot be measured. They perform for the metrics. They protect themselves. They hedge. The very behavior the verification was meant to guard against begins to emerge from the verification itself. This is the honest boundary. This is what Han Fei's philosophy requires you to see clearly, if you are going to use it without being used by it. It is a magnificent defensive flaw and a constricting ceiling. The right system for the right conditions, the wrong system for the wrong ones. And the question that the dossier we are drawing from is building toward, the question that will need the full weight of what happened in 221 BCE and in the 15 years after it to answer properly, is: what happens when you do not recognize that boundary? What happens when the system designed for the floor gets applied all the way to the ceiling and beyond? That story is coming. You can feel it gathering in the background, like weather on the horizon, unhurried, inevitable, the king who will read those essays, the classmate who will recognize the competition that the system demands eliminating, the cell, the poison, the pardon that arrives at the wrong moment. But first, let the machinery we have just moved through settle into its shape, because it is a real shape, and it is worth holding. The two handles, reward and punishment. Whoever actually holds them rules, regardless of the org chart. Keep them. Do not let them drift into other hands, even trusted ones. The distributed design, no one indispensable, no single point of failure, no one person whose departure or betrayal can collapse the structure you have built. Spread the knowledge, spread the access, spread the relationships. Build the system so it survives ordinary turnover and even extraordinary betrayal. The hidden preference. Keep your own biases from becoming leverage others use against you. By not revealing what you want to hear, you make it harder for others to tell you only that. The information that reaches you stays closer to real. The system that works without saints, designed for ordinary people with ordinary motivations. The mechanism should produce good outcomes from normal human material. Do not plan for a genius. Build what works without one. The public and consistent rule, law that does not fawn on the noble. The same standard for everyone, written down, known in advance, applied reliably. Predictability is not softness. It is function. And the verification, Xingming, performance against title, with audits and KPIs and escrow and separation of duties as its modern descendants. Trust, but verify. Not because you suspect, but because the system should not have to depend on your suspicion or your confidence being correctly calibrated. The mechanism handles it. You do not have to guess right about any individual. The structure catches what individual judgment misses. These are the tools. This is the working machinery that Han Fei spent his strange, brilliant, constrained life assembling. Not a philosophy of cruelty. An operating system for a world you cannot trust. Cold, yes. Mechanical, yes. Built on assumptions about human nature that may make you uncomfortable when you hear them stated plainly. But functional, testable, still running, in its modern translations, in the institutions and contracts and accountability structures you operate inside every day. The carpenter does not trust the wood. He shapes it, and the mechanism, the beautifully designed, impersonal, incentive-aligned mechanism, is the shaping. Now, the man who wrote all of this down, who could not say it aloud, but could write it with a precision that crossed centuries, was sitting in the weak state of Han while the world was reorganizing itself around him. and somewhere to the west, in the state of Qin, a king was reading pages that had been passed to him through the channels that knowledge travels, and that king was reading the words of the stuttering prince and thinking something that would alter both their fates. The king had no idea the author was alive, and the author had no idea the king was reading. But that is the story that lives in the next part of this long, quiet night. That convergence, that recognition, that catastrophe. The machine eating the man who built it, and the empire that rose from the wreckage, and what it all means about the boundary between a tool that saves you and a tool that destroys you. For now, let the machinery rest in your mind the way a mechanism rests when it is not running, still, precise, every gear in its place. Somewhere to the west of Han, in the year that the dossier does not pin to a single month, because history rarely does, a king was sitting with pages. He was not yet the first emperor of anything. He was King Zheng of Qin, and Qin was the strongest state in a world of states that had been bleeding into each other for centuries. He was methodical. He was cold in the way that people who have survived court politics from childhood are cold, not as a personality trait, but as a survival skill calcified into reflex. And someone had passed him a bundle of written essays, the way knowledge moved in that world, hand to hand, clay and silk and wood, the slow circulation of ideas through geography. The essays were called, among other things, The Five Vermin and Solitary Indignation. Wu Du Gu Fen. The Five Vermin argued that certain kinds of people, scholars who traded in old books, persuaders who sold their rhetoric to whoever paid, private armies loyal to lords rather than law, merchants who hoarded necessities, and craftsmen of political manipulation, were parasites on any state that wanted to function. Not immoral. Parasites, the distinction matters in Han Fei's world, where morality rarely does the analytical work. These five types, he argued, weakened the state's ability to enforce clear law and reward genuine service, because they created alternative power centers, alternative sources of prestige and safety, that let people root around the official mechanisms of reward and punishment. You could not run a clean system of Xingming while private networks of loyalty and influence were threading through it like roots through old mortar. Solitary indignation was more personal, or at least more raw. It was a meditation on the loneliness of the man who sees clearly and cannot get anyone to listen. The minister who understands the state's disease but cannot reach the ruler. The counselor who gives correct advice and watches it ignored while flatterers thrive. Han Fei had spent years trying to advise the king of Han, his own home state, and Han had kept shrinking, kept losing ground, kept failing to reform while Qin grew stronger. The indignation in that essay is not theatrical. It is the specific, tired frustration of a man who has been right about something for a long time and watched the wrongness win anyway. King Zheng read these pages. And Sima Qian, writing roughly a century later in his Shiji, his records of the grand historian, preserved what the king reportedly said. The king held the writing and said something to the effect that if he could only meet the man who wrote these words, if he could only know him, he would die content. Not know of him, know him. The most powerful man in China was reading a book and falling into it the way you fall into something that says the thing you have been trying to say yourself, the thing that has been living in your chest without language until suddenly there it is, precise and sharp and finally named. He recognized the mind behind the writing the way you recognize a mind that works like yours, or works the way you wish yours did. He read the impersonal machinery of the argument and saw something almost intimate in it. And he did not know, the king of the most powerful state in the world, surrounded by ministers and intelligence and messengers and the whole apparatus of Qin's extraordinary bureaucracy. He did not know that the man who had written these pages was alive, was in fact a prince of the state of Han, was in fact someone who could be summoned. This is the thing about information asymmetry that Han Fei himself would have recognized immediately if the information had been about anyone but himself. The ruler is systematically given the information that is easy to give. The information that requires someone to say the author of the essays you just read is a living man, a prince of a rival state, and we have not told you this. That information requires initiative, requires someone to synthesize across domains, requires breaking through the comfortable flow of what advisors feel safe saying. The king's ministers knew things. But knowing things and telling things are different operations, governed by different incentives. So the king admired the writing of a man he thought was ancient, or at least safely past. And Han Fei sat in Han, still trying to make himself heard. The convergence, when it came from the outside. Qin applied military pressure on Han. This was not unusual. It was the basic weather of the Warring States period, and Han, running out of options as it had been running out of options for decades, sent an envoy to Qin to negotiate. The envoy they sent was Han Fei. It is worth sitting with that choice for a moment. Han Fei had been trying to advise the King of Han for years. The King of Han had not listened, or not listened consistently, or not implemented what he heard in any sustained way. And now, when the situation was desperate enough that Han needed its best mind in the room, the best mind was sent to the other side's room. Whether that was tactical, Han Fei as a prize, an offering, a demonstration of good faith, or simply the most obvious move given who he was and what Qin wanted, the result was the same. The stuttering prince, who could not persuade aloud, found himself in Qin, the place where his ideas had already arrived ahead of him, carried in pages that a king had read and loved, without knowing whose hands had written them. And now King Zheng knew. The meeting, as Sima Qian tells it, was everything the king had wanted. He recognized the mind. He saw in person the writer he had admired, the encounter that should have secured Han Fei's position. That should have been the moment the theorist found the powerful patron who could actually implement what he had designed. That encounter became, instead, the beginning of the end. Not because the king turned on him, because of someone else in the room. Li Si, who had studied under Shunzi alongside Han Fei. Li Si, who had looked at the same philosophical landscape and made the same basic choice, that human nature was not good and needed to be shaped by law and consequence, but who had made that choice in service of his own advancement rather than as a committed intellectual project. Li Si was already a top minister in Qin. He was already powerful. He had already climbed, through a combination of genuine talent and ruthless self-interest, to a position of real influence in the state that was about to inherit the world. And Li Si looked at Han Fei and saw exactly what Han Fei's own philosophy would have predicted he would see. A threat. Not a threat to Qin. Not a threat to the king. A threat to Li Si. Because Li Si understood, could not have failed to understand, given that he had read the same texts from the same teacher, that Han Fei was better, more rigorous, more original. That given time and the king's favour, Han Fei would outshine him, would become the indispensable voice in the court that Li Si currently occupied. The incentives were clear. The calculation was not complicated. A rational, self-interested actor in Li Si's position, operating in a court where Xingming and the two handles were the real currency of power, had one logical move: eliminate the rival before the rival eliminated him. This is not a story Sima Qian tells with moral satisfaction. He is too good a historian for that. But he records what Li Si and another minister, Yao Jia, reportedly did. They went to the king, and they poisoned the well. Not metaphorically, though the metaphor would come later. They told the king that Han Fei was ultimately loyal to Han. That whatever his talent, whatever his philosophy, whatever his ideas about law and impersonal administration, at the root of it he was a prince of a rival state. That if Qin used him and then was forced to let him return to Han, Han would have the benefit of his knowledge and his relationships, that he was, in the end, a security risk. The argument was not stupid. It used the very logic of Han Fei's own system against him. You cannot trust people to act against their own interests. A man whose homeland is Han will, when the chips are down, act for Han. Read the incentives. Do not read the heart. The king had him imprisoned, and then Li Si sent poison. Sima Qian does not give us the full scene with cinematic clarity. He is a historian, not a playwright, and this is a moment where the record is thinner than the significance demands. But the outline is stark enough. Han Fei, in a Qin cell, was given poison. The options that presented themselves to him in that cell, the options available to a stuttering prince from a state that had sent him as a bargaining chip to a rival's court, now sitting in that rival's prison while a classmate's slander settled over him like a sentence, those options were not many. He died before the king could reconsider. And the king did reconsider. Sima Qian tells us this too. The king sent to release him. The pardon was on its way. But by the time it arrived, Han Fei was dead. The man who had written that calamity comes from those you love and trust had been destroyed, not by an enemy, not by someone he had reason to suspect, but by a classmate. Someone who had sat in the same classroom, read the same texts, learned from the same teacher. Someone whose intellectual debts to Han Fei's ideas were real even as his hands delivered the poison. The doctrine that said assume rational self-interest, verify everything, trust no one's loyalty over their incentives, that doctrine had described its own author's murder with cold accuracy and not been able to save him. There is something in that which takes a moment to arrive at fully. It is not a simple irony. It is heavier than that. Han Fei did not fail to see what was coming because he was naive or sentimental or because he had not thought through the logic. He had thought through the logic more carefully than almost anyone alive. He had written it down systematically, exhaustively, over dozens of essays. He understood that the classmate who might outshine you is not protected by the friendship you once shared. He understood that the incentive to eliminate a rival is impersonal and therefore not preventable by goodwill. He understood all of this. And he was still in the cell. Which tells you something the philosophy, taken on its own terms, might not make obvious. Knowing the system does not automatically give you the power to operate it in your favor. Knowledge of the mechanism and control of the mechanism are different things. Han Fei had the analysis, Li Si had the access, the timing, and the king's ear. Shu, the technique, the hidden administrative art, requires not just understanding, but position, requires the proximity to power that Han Fei, as a foreign-born envoy in a cell, did not have. The philosophy is a tool. A tool in someone else's hands is not yours. So the man died, and the ideas lived. They lived in the most concrete possible way. The state of Qin, shaped by decades of legalist administrative reform, by the logic of Fa and Shu and Shi that Han Fei had synthesized and that earlier ministers had implemented in partial forms, continued on its trajectory. In 221 BC, 12 years after Han Fei's death in that cell, King Zheng completed what no ruler before him had managed. He unified China. All the warring states, that centuries-long proliferation of competing kingdoms and principalities, and the constant grinding violence of a world with too many power centers and not enough law, were brought under a single administration. King Zheng became Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, and the thing that held it together, administratively, was not virtue. It was not the ritual order of Confucianism, it was the machinery. Standardized law, the same weights and measures in every corner of a vast territory, a single written script so that documents could travel across dialects and be read by officials who spoke differently, axle widths standardized so that carts could travel the same roads without the roads themselves becoming the limiting variable. These are not glamorous reforms, but they are exactly the reforms that a legalist administrator would design, uniform, impersonal, measurable, not dependent on the particular wisdom or virtue of the local official, because the system constrained the local official, whether or not he was wise or virtuous. Han Fei had argued that a good system lets an average ruler succeed. Qin Shi Huang was not average. He was, by most accounts, ferociously capable. But the administrative layer he inherited and extended was designed for replication, for durability beyond any single person. The empire that emerged from the unification was, in its bones, Han Fei's design, built from his ideas, managed by his logic, built and managed also by Li Si, who was now the chancellor of the empire, who had poisoned the man whose ideas he was now implementing, who was, by the end of the Warring States period, arguably the most powerful official in the world. For a while. The machine that runs on incentives and consequences does not make exceptions for its architects. It cannot. That is the whole point of it. If the machine made exceptions for the people who designed it, it would stop being the machine and become something else, something personal, something that bends around relationships and loyalties, something exactly like the systems Han Fei had argued were too weak to survive. The machine has no memory of service, no account of past loyalty. It reads the current incentives and acts on them. That is its strength. That is also what it does to you when your incentives stop aligning with the interests of the person at the top. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BC. He had been working himself toward death for years, obsessing over immortality in the way powerful men do, when the one thing their power cannot purchase becomes the thing they want most. He died on a journey, away from the capital, and what followed was a sequence of events that Han Fei, had he been alive, would have recognized immediately as the failure mode of a system that lost control of the two handles. Li Si, who had spent decades cultivating his position, who had survived the death of a predecessor and the poisoning of a classmate, who had built a career on reading incentives accurately, Li Si made a mistake. He threw his lot in with the wrong faction in the succession crisis that followed the emperor's death. He miscalculated. And the machine he had helped build and operate for 20 years turned on him with no hesitation and no sentiment. He was arrested. He was subjected to the 5 punishments. He was cut in two at the waist. Sima Qian records that at the moment of his execution, Li Si turned to his son and said something about the things they would never do again together. Walk out the east gate of their hometown with a yellow dog to hunt hares. It is a sudden human image in a very long story of mechanism and calculation. The man who had lived by cold logic died missing the small warm things that cold logic cannot generate. Whatever he had built, whatever he had destroyed, whatever calculation had seemed correct at the time, in the end the system consumed him with the same impersonal efficiency it had consumed Han Fei. The Qin dynasty itself did not outlast Li Si by much. Qin Shi Huang had unified China in 221 BC. The dynasty fell in 206 BC. 15 years, the shortest-lived major dynasty in Chinese history. The empire that legalist statecraft had built, that had absorbed centuries of smaller states, that had produced the standardized administrative machinery Han Fei had theorized, that empire, under the pressure of its own harshness, collapsed. And this is where the honest reckoning has to happen, the one that the title promised and that good abandonment requires. Because the failure of Qin is not an accident that happened despite the philosophy. It is the philosophy's failure mode, demonstrably and historically. And you cannot hold the toolkit without also holding this. A system built entirely on penalty and reward, on verification and consequence, on the assumption that every person is following their incentives and must be constrained accordingly. That system has a cost that compounds over time. The cost is trust. Or rather, the systematic destruction of it. Consider what it does to the people inside it. If you are an official in a Qin-administered territory and you know that helpful overreach is punished, that doing the right thing outside your defined role is a violation, that the capkeeper gets punished for covering the sleeping king with a robe, then you stop doing the right thing outside your defined role. You stop. You pull your attention inside the bright line of your defined responsibility, and you do not look over it. Because looking over it is risk, and the system has taught you that risk is not rewarded. What this produces is compliance without initiative. The letter of the law followed with perfect accuracy, and the spirit of it hollowed out. Because the spirit requires judgment, and judgment is precisely what the system does not trust you to exercise. And then there is the problem of the measures themselves. Han Fei was right that you cannot trust stated intentions. You measure outcomes instead. You build Xingming, the minister proposes what he will deliver, you measure what he actually delivers, you punish the gap. This is sound. But there is a trap inside it that Han Fei did not write about, or at least not clearly, a trap that would not be named until the 20th century in a completely different context. The trap is this. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This is what is now called Goodhart's law, after the economist Charles Goodhart, who identified it in the context of monetary policy. But it is not a law about monetary policy. It is a law about measurement and incentives, which means it is a law that lives inside every system built the way Han Fei built his. The moment you tell someone that their performance will be judged by a specific number, they stop optimizing for the thing the number was meant to represent and start optimizing for the number. The number was a proxy for the real outcome. But once it becomes the target, the proxy is all that matters, and the real outcome drifts. A general who is measured by the number of enemy heads brought back will bring back heads. Whether those heads were taken in a way that actually served the campaign's strategy is a different question, and it is a question the metric cannot ask. A minister measured by the completion of infrastructure projects will complete infrastructure projects. Whether the completed projects are built well, or built where they are needed most, or built at a cost that makes sense, is not legible to a system that counts completions. The system that was designed to eliminate the problem of flattery and deception. The minister who tells the ruler what the ruler wants to hear produced a new version of the same problem. Now the minister tells the metric what the metric wants to see. The deception moved. It moved from the oral to the numerical, from the sincere-sounding speech to the sincere-looking measurement. And a system that has been specifically designed to distrust sincerity-sounding speech has no defense against sincere-looking measurement, because it was built on the assumption that measurement was the solution. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure of completeness. Han Fei solved one class of problem with elegant, rigorous machinery, and in doing so created the conditions for the next class of problem to emerge. Every system does this. Every solution generates the problem it did not anticipate. The question is not whether the system is perfect. No system is. But whether you know where the edges are. And the edge of legalism, historically, turned out to be the edge between a system that functions well as a floor and a system that fails catastrophically when used as a ceiling. As a floor, clear law, public and known and applied equally, is a genuine good. In a world where aristocratic privilege meant the rules bent around whoever had the most connections, the legalist insistence that the law does not fawn on the noble was radical and humane. Predictable consequences, rewards reliable enough to be believed, punishments certain enough to be feared, are better than arbitrary, unpredictable power. If you are designing an institution from scratch, if you are trying to create accountability where none existed, if you are trying to stop one person from controlling everything through personal relationships and unverifiable claims, Han Fei's toolkit is where you start. Separation of duties. Multiple sign-offs, audits, written rules published and enforced without exception. These are not cruelties, they are protections. As a ceiling, if you run the entire edifice on distrust alone, if you remove all space for judgment, all reward for initiative, all tolerance for the human variance that cannot be compressed into a metric, if you punish the servant for covering the sleeping king because the covering was technically outside his role, you build a world in which the only safe behavior is precisely defined behavior, and in which anything outside the definition is risk that rational people will avoid. That world is rigid. Rigid things break under pressure. Flexible things. Organizations where people exercise judgment, where initiative is sometimes rewarded even when it exceeds the job description. Where trust is extended provisionally, and the extension is, sometimes, honored, those things absorb shocks that rigid things cannot. The Qin dynasty was very rigid. It lasted 15 years. The Han dynasty that followed it, which consciously softened the harshest legalist edges while keeping the administrative machinery underneath, lasted 4 centuries. And this is the thing that history shows happened next, and that the dossier calls by a phrase in Chinese that translates roughly to Confucian outside, legalist inside. Wai Ru Ne Fa. The formula that shaped Chinese imperial governance for most of the 2,000 years that followed the Qin dynasty was not a clean choice between legalism and Confucianism. It was not an honest renunciation of Han Fei's cold machinery in favor of the Confucian program of virtue and ritual. It was a layering. The public face was Confucian, ritual propriety, filial respect. The emperor as the son of heaven ruling through moral example, the officials selected through examinations in the classical texts that emphasized virtue and right relationship. The rhetoric was Confucian, the ceremonies were Confucian, the language of legitimacy was Confucian. Underneath, the administration ran on legalist logic, standardized law, performance measurement, accountability mechanisms, the organization of official ranks by defined responsibility, the use of reward and punishment, the two handles, as the real levers of governance. Han Fei's tools, doing Han Fei's work, inside a Confucian wrapper that made the whole enterprise legible and acceptable to a population that found pure legalism too cold and too naked in its cynicism. The philosophy never left. It just stopped using its own name. And it has continued not using its own name, in forms that would not be recognized as legalism by anyone who had not been paying attention to the underlying logic. When a modern corporation writes an employment contract with specific deliverables and penalty clauses for non-performance, when an international trade agreement includes verification mechanisms and dispute resolution procedures rather than relying on the good faith of signatories, when a government agency is required to publish its metrics and be audited against them, when a financial institution requires separation of duties between the person who approves a transaction and the person who executes it, none of these institutions would describe themselves as legalist. They would describe themselves as prudent, as best practice, as what you do when you need an accountability structure that doesn't depend on everyone involved being unusually virtuous. That is exactly what Han Fei would have said. The principal-agent problem, formalized by economists Jensen and Meckling in 1976, built into the mathematical framework that won Hurwitz, Maskin and Meyerson the Nobel in economics in 2007, is the ruler-minister problem in notation. How do you get someone who is acting on your behalf and who has information you don't have to act in your interest rather than their own? The modern answer involves incentive alignment, monitoring, and contract design. The vocabulary is different. The logic is identical. 22 centuries of separate intellectual development converging on the same structure because the structure is not a cultural artifact. It is a consequence of the shape of the problem. The problem has not changed. The problem is the problem of delegation. The problem of the gap between what you can observe and what is actually happening. The problem of the person whose job is to serve your interests, but whose incentives are their own. That problem was there when Han Fei was writing. It is there in every organization that exists today. It will be there in every organization that exists a century from now. The tools for managing it make the rules clear, align the incentives, verify the output, distribute the dependencies so no single point of failure can undo the whole thing. Those tools are not dated, they are durable. But, and this is the last thing to hold alongside all of that, the thing that makes the toolkit calibrated rather than merely cold, you cannot run entirely on verification. The costs of a zero-trust system are real. And they are not just the dramatic costs that history provides in the form of Qin's 15-year collapse. They are the everyday costs of the overhead of monitoring. The time and energy spent tracking and auditing and measuring that could have been spent on the actual work. The talented person who leaves an organization because they find it insulting to be treated as a rational self-interest machine when they are also a human being who sometimes just wants to do good work because it is good work. The collaboration that doesn't happen because the rules of defined responsibility create 100 small barriers between people who might otherwise share something useful. high-trust environments where people extend judgment and initiative without waiting for the metric to authorize it. Where the expectation of good faith is itself part of the culture, those environments have real advantages that low-trust environments cannot replicate through monitoring alone. They are faster. They are more adaptive. They generate information that would never survive the filter of a formal reporting structure. They innovate at the edges, which is where innovation lives. Han Fei's system is not wrong about any of the facts it describes. Human beings do follow incentives. Rational self-interest is a real force. The minister who benefits from your ignorance will often maintain your ignorance. The classmate who benefits from your elimination will, under the right conditions, pursue your elimination. These are true things. The philosophy's failure is not that it describes falsehoods. It is that it describes truths so completely that it has no room for anything else, and the things it leaves out, the small, irrational acts of genuine loyalty, the initiative taken outside the job description, the relationship that holds under pressure not because of incentive alignment, but because of something harder to name. Those things matter. They matter in ways the system cannot capture. And a system that cannot capture something important and then treats the unimportant things it can capture as the whole truth will eventually mistake the map for the territory. The floor is solid, the ceiling is low. You carry Han Fei's toolkit in the part of your mind that reads incentive structures, that asks who benefits from this outcome, that looks for the mechanism underneath the stated reason, that checks whether the accountability is real or performed, that asks whether you have built your position so that no single betrayal undoes the whole thing. That part of the toolkit is not cynicism. It is clarity. And you carry the knowledge of the ceiling in the part of your mind that extends trust provisionally, that leaves room for the initiative that falls outside the job description, that does not punish the servant for covering the sleeping king, that knows Goodhart's law is in the room whenever a metric becomes the thing rather than the measure of the thing. The man who wrote the operating system did not get to run it. He was defeated by the logic he had described so precisely that the description was the defeat. Li Si read the same texts. Li Si understood the same principles. Li Si had the position and the access and the timing. And in the cold machinery of a court that ran on exactly the incentives Han Fei had theorized, Han Fei was the threat that a rational, self-interested rival eliminated. This is the thing the stuttering prince knew and could not protect himself from. You can describe the current exactly and still drown in it. Knowledge of the mechanism is not the same as power over the mechanism. The philosophy is a lens. A lens shows you what is there. It does not change what is there. It does not give you the leverage to change what is there. That leverage comes from position, from timing, from the accumulation of relationships and resources that are themselves subject to the same impersonal forces the philosophy describes. You cannot think your way out of the structure. You can only see it more clearly, navigate it more carefully, and build in enough redundancy that when the current pulls at you, as it will, because the current always pulls, you are not entirely alone against it. Han Fei was alone against it. His ideas were not. His ideas crossed the centuries in the bodies of institutions that do not know his name, in contracts and constitutions and accountability structures and audit processes and the ordinary machinery of governance and organization that every person in the modern world moves inside every day. The stuttering prince, who could not persuade in person, persuaded everyone. Just slowly, just without credit. just in the silent way that a foundational assumption shapes the design of every structure built on it, without any of the structures necessarily knowing what they are built on. There is something right about that, something that fits the philosophy itself. A system that works should not depend on anyone remembering the name of the person who designed it. An impersonal mechanism that runs because the logic is sound, not because the founder is present. That is exactly what Han Fei argued a good system should be. He designed himself out of necessity. And he was. The cold clarity is a gift if you take it as a flaw. The knowledge that people act on their incentives, that you should verify rather than trust, that clear law applied equally is more reliable than the virtue of any individual, that your position should be designed to survive betrayal, that you should hold the two handles and be careful about who else holds them, that the system should outlast any particular person, including yourself. This knowledge does not require you to become the thing it describes. You can know that everyone follows incentives and still choose to exercise judgment. You can build verification structures and still extend provisional trust within them. You can design for redundancy and still care about the people in the system. The tool is not the ceiling. You are not the tool. And somewhere in the distance, at the edge of this long night, there is a question that might be worth sleeping on. Not answering right now, just holding lightly as the room quiets and the mind begins its own slow drift toward rest. The question is something like, where in your life have you been trusting intentions when you should have been reading incentives? And where have you been reading incentives when you should have been extending trust? Those are different errors. Both cost something. Han Fei built an entire architecture around the first error and built a world in which the second error could not occur. And the world he built lasted 15 years and consumed the people who made it. The architecture that outlasted him was the one that understood both errors were real and tried to balance them rather than eliminate one entirely. That balance does not have a name as clean as legalism. It does not have a 55-chapter treatise. It does not have a stuttering prince who systematized it with cold, rigorous precision over a lifetime of failure and observation and writing. It is just the ordinary difficult work of being inside institutions with other people, reading the structures clearly, and still making room for the things that fall outside the structures. Holding the cold toolkit and the warm knowledge simultaneously, without letting either one crowd the other out. Han Fei could not do it. He was too alone, too confined by the logic he had perfected, too much the prisoner of the system he had diagnosed. But he handed us the diagnosis. He handed us the mechanism. And the mechanism, carried forward through Qin and Han and every administrative structure that came after, down through Wairune Fa and through 2,000 years of empires that said Confucian things and did legalist things, down through the principal-agent problem and mechanism design and Goodhart's law and trust but verify and the ordinary contracts and accountability structures of the world you wake up in. Tomorrow the mechanism is still running, still precise, every gear in its place. The man who built it is long gone. The cells of Qin are dust. Li Si, who sent the poison, was himself sent to dust by the same logic, cut in two in the same empire's last days, and he too is gone. King Zheng, who read the essays and wished to meet the man who wrote them, he is gone. And the dynasty he built and named for himself lasted a generation and collapsed, and the dynasty that replaced it softened the edges and lasted 4 centuries, and that dynasty is gone too. What stays is the idea, the cold, functional, impersonal, still running idea. Read incentives, not hearts. Verify output, not intention. Hold the two handles and be careful who else holds them. Design the position to survive betrayal. Publish the rules and apply them equally. Build the system to outlast any one person. Know the floor, know the ceiling, use the tool without becoming it. And know, somewhere in the back of the mind, where the clearest things tend to settle, that the man who wrote all of this did not get to use it to save himself. That the philosophy is not a shield. That clarity is not safety. That knowing the current does not keep you out of the water. It keeps you honest about where you are. That is enough. That may be the most useful thing anyone has ever thought to offer. The room is quiet now. The long thread of this has been wound back to its beginning. The cell, the poison, the classmate who did exactly what the doctrine said he would, the pardon that arrived too late, the empire that rose and fell, and the ideas that slipped quietly through the collapse and kept running in the structures that outlived them all. You have the operating system. You have the failure analysis. You have the honest boundary between what it does well and what it does to you if you trust it too much. There is nothing left to search for tonight. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.